Would you pray with me? Just prepare our hearts for the word. Lord, we just come before you this morning, so thankful for your love. Just humbled and amazed that you would love us. I'm still humbled and amazed that you continue loving us. But that's really because I'm looking at me and not looking at you. And I just pray, Lord, could you get our eyes onto you this morning? As we look into your word, would you do that fresh work in us that would make us see you and see your values and embrace your values? Lord, you are not willing that any should perish. Would you put that will into our will, that we would not be willing for any to perish? Lord, we just get so used to it. And we just live as though eternity is not really eternity. And I'm just asking that this morning, as we look into your word, as we see what you said to your disciples, Jesus, that you would speak to us as your disciples. And that you help us to see what we need to see to become what you've called us to become. Open our eyes, Lord. Open our eyes. Open my eyes. And I pray you to teach through me for your glory this morning. In our joy. Susie and I have been canning some peaches over the last couple of weeks. You know, when you say, oh yeah, we've been canning peaches, well, there's a lot more to it than just saying you canned some peaches. And when you get done, you realize you're still not done, because then you've got to take every little scrap of peaches that is scattered all across the kitchen and clean it up, you know. And so it's an interesting thing, because I think so often when we see things, we tend to see them in the finished condition rather than in the process that it took to get there. And if we don't see or discern the process in spiritual things, sometimes we're looking for instantaneous spiritual work rather than recognizing that there's a process. And so I want to talk today, as we're talking about this walking the walk, understanding what God is calling us to do as a lifestyle, as believers, to talk about this process we talk about called evangelism. It's something that oftentimes people are not very comfortable with, sharing their faith, and yet Jesus finishes a conversation with the woman at the well, and then he has a conversation with his disciples. And my perception of that conversation is that the guys at this point didn't get it. And so we tend to read the story of the woman at the well and go, oh yeah, see, this is how you're supposed to do it. But it is a great example for us. But he's talking about why didn't they see this? And so we're talking today about this idea of open your eyes, because God wants you to open your eyes. He has a work to do through you. He has a work for you. He has a work in you. But your cooperation is a part of the process. And so it's important for us to understand this process. And so when his disciples come back, it says that they were wondering why he was talking with them. I'm in John chapter 4, in verse 35, he's talking to them about what took place, and he's using this as an opportunity to teach them. And I want it to be an opportunity to teach us, because believers are Christ's witnesses to the world. We're boldly declaring by word and deed Christ's power to save until he comes. That's what we're here to do. And so sometimes the needs of people around us is obvious. If you've been watching any of the news and you've looked at what's going on down there in the Bahamas, and you go, wow, that's just an overwhelming amount of need. And yet if you look at the neighbors across from you and they've got their car, and they've got their house, and they've got their yard, and everything is sweet and wonderful, and you go, they're fine. Do you know what I mean? And yet those people in the Bahamas had it made just a moment ago, just a few days ago, and now it's all changed. And I think we don't realize how fast life can change. And when you look at life in the eternal perspective, we need to open our eyes to get an eternal perspective. So I want to read here from John 4, and hoping that the Lord will stir us up to get the value that He wants us to have in His kingdom for His work, but also for the people around us, that will see people the way He does. So in John 4, beginning with verse 35, He says, "Do you not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And already he who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for life eternal, that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." So Jesus is talking to his disciples, and this is the case so often. He asks them a question. Don't you say there's 4 months and then comes the harvest? And in all likelihood, he was looking across a field there in Samaria where the sprouts were just coming up from the field. He says, hey, you say it's 4 months. And I tell you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields. They're already white for harvest. And it's very possible, I'm not saying this is what we see, that because you read of the next few verses, that there's actually a group of people coming out from Samaria, from Sychar, coming out to the well in their white robes. He says the fields are white to harvest. Don't you guys see the real harvest? This is what we're really about here. So as these Samaritans were coming back because the woman at the well had went in and told them, hey, this guy told me everything I ever did, which is interesting because he clearly didn't, or at least our story doesn't tell us everything, but he told enough to know that she knew he knew. You know what I mean? She had her mail read to her, and she says, could this be the Messiah? And so she introduces a question that God uses to draw people from this city. But Jesus has a group of guys that aren't ready for what he's about to do. Have you ever found that you're not ready for what God's about to do? You know, God does stuff and we just like, what? And you've been praying for something, all of a sudden something happens and you're like, we're not ready. But he says, you say there's 4 months and comes the harvest. He says, I tell you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, they're white. He says, I want you to see something that you're not seeing. Notice the spiritual conditions of those around you. Yeah, I want you to open your eyes. He said, I want you to open your eyes. In all likelihood, because if we look at this, Jesus was sitting by the well and the woman came. The guys were going to get lunch. Chick-fil-A in town, they were going to get lunch. And as they're coming, they passed her both ways. And I'm seeing, Jesus said, you didn't even see it. You didn't see what I was doing. And so I want you to notice, you see, we have a perception problem. Go ahead and tell the person next to you, you have a perception problem. Help them out, because we don't, you see, you don't know what you don't know. And then don't act like you do. You've never had that experience that somebody's bragging about something and talking about something and you realize they do not even know what they're talking about. And so Jesus is getting his disciples ready for something he wants to do. He says, hey, you need to re-look at this field. You need to re-look at this work that we're doing. And so I believe Jesus wants to change our perspective. So he says, open your eyes. He says, lift up your eyes. He says, And it's kind of an interesting thing. Well, why do we need to lift up our eyes? Because we've got our eyes on who? On us. On our stuff, on our issues, on our concerns. And it's right there, isn't it? You know, your own stuff gets right there in front of your face, and that's all you can see. And he says, hey, would you just lift up get your eyes off of you, quit the navel gazing. Let's get beyond your stuff. I'm doing something. One of the things you see as you go all the way through the Gospels, in fact, all the way through the Bible, is that God is working. So we should expect it. And I think sometimes because it takes so long for us to see some of the things that we want to see, because God never works on our watch. You know, you lived long enough to discover that, haven't you? It says we wait so long, we then don't expect it anymore. We're not asking. We've asked and we've kind of we quit asking. But God's at work. He's always working. And so we need to be people who are expecting it. If you're going to join God in His work, you have to be expecting God to do a work. And so that's something that, you know, we worked all summer, actually all winter, they were working towards Vacation Bible School, saying, hey, can we get ready to see God do a work? And we said, can we refocus the way we present the gospel to children so they'll get a clearer picture of Jesus? And they worked and they prepared. And what was really cool, I loved it, but the team expected to see God work. And they noticed God at work, and they saw God work. And so we saw numerous children making decisions for Christ. And we had parents coming to classes about parenting. And we're like, well, we've never done that before. Okay, well, can we do that? Well, sometimes you're afraid to do something because you're afraid you're going to look like a what? Failure. Because if God doesn't work, it won't work, right? What we're doing, if God doesn't work, but see, if you're not willing to risk that, then you're not going to experience that great joy of seeing God come through. And so, it's interesting that Jesus talks about this all the way through his life in many different places, but in Luke chapter 10, he displays this in an interesting way because he is getting ready to send out his disciples. And he's already sent out the 12. Now he's come back, he's going to send out 70. It says that the Lord had appointed 70 others and sent them out in pairs ahead of him to every city and place where he himself was going to come. Now I'm telling you this because we're going to read this verse here in a minute, but most of you read this verse. But we don't oftentimes read it in context. We pick our little verses out of the Bible kind of like treats, and we go, oh, that's a really neat verse, and yet there's something around it. This verse, would you read it with me? And he was saying to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Now you hear that, our minds tend to think, oh, that's Jesus with 12 guys trying to reach the nation. No. He's already done that. Those 12 went out, and then, we don't know if they all brought back 5, but there's now 70, and he's sending out 70, and Jesus is saying the laborers are few. He's got a team of 70 that he's sending out where? To all the places he was going to come, it says in the first verse. Jesus had a plan. God's at work. He knows what he's going to do, and he was sending people ahead of him. Are you with me yet? He was sending ahead to the work he was going to do, and he says, here's what I want you to do. Let's go back to that verse. He says, I want you to be a prayer. He says, pray first. I'm sending you out. He says, the harvest is plentiful. There are people here to be reached. He says, but the laborers are few. What's our perspective usually? Oh, there's just not very many people when I come to Jesus. It's just hard to get people to come to Jesus. And Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says there's lots of people. He says, my problem was with the people who've already came. I always think that is interesting. And he says, therefore, he says, pray, beseech the Lord of the harvest. Now wait a minute. I want you to think, and when you read your Bible. I mean, Jesus says, to the guys he's sending out, he says, I want you to pray that God would send out more workers to the Lord of the harvest. If he's the Lord of the harvest, how come I have to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest? Isn't that just his job? Can't he just... Do you understand what God's doing? He's inviting you into his work. This is this awesome thing, friends, that we get to team up with God. You're invited into this whole process. He says, I want you to call on me to do this work. And sometimes when we pray for people, Lord, change them. That's how we pray usually, isn't it? Lord, change them. And you find out if you pray long enough that God uses that prayer to what? To change you. That's the greatest thing you'll ever do. Pray for your enemies. Pray for other people. It will change you. And I believe when he says, I want you to notice these conditions. I want you to lift up your eyes. One of the ways you lift up your eyes is by bending your knees. Are you with me? And so one of the things we do here at JP is I encourage you to specifically think about who are you seeking to reach. And so in your bulletins, there were these field finders, all right? And it just allows you to say, who are the people that God's put around me? Because when you begin praying for people to come to Christ, and you begin praying for God to use people in these lives, these are people he's put me in life with, then you know what happens? You notice your eyes open. Here's what I find anyway. When I pray, my eyes are open to what God is doing much more than if I don't pray. So, happened here just this last year. I was out in Merlin for something. I was for a meeting. And I'm there in Merlin. I'm getting ready to leave. And I'm like, okay, what's on the schedule? What's next? And it was like, oh, you're going to see so-and-so. I'm like, it's not on my schedule. Can the Holy Spirit give you a nudge? Are you open to that? We were talking about, make us aware of your presence. We were just singing that song. And so I went to visit this person that I've been praying for a decade. And I was able to sit and share with him through a little bit of give and take conversation. He's clearly not a believer and told me before I left, he says, I understand what you're saying, James. He says, I'm not following Jesus, but I understand what you're saying. And it was a nudge. And when you do that, you step into the work. He says, so I pray, and the funny thing is, who does God use? The people who pray. See, that's why some of you are afraid to pray. It's like, oh, okay, God's going to use me. God's going to make me do something. Don't be afraid of God sending you to the deepest, darkest Africa. Because if he does, you're going to love being there. That's part of the process, okay? Wherever he sends you, you will enjoy that experience. He's put me in some weird places. You guys know that. And yet I find joy in serving him in the place that he sends us. And so start your list. Lift up your eyes. Begin praying. The neat thing, if you were to look at my list, I use the back as well because the front's not enough spots. But also, I've got people circled on here, people who come to Christ. And so even as I'm praying for somebody else to come, I've got a guy, this is a new card. He's 25 years he's been on my card. And I'm praying. Because I believe God's working. And it's just last month I had this conversation. He goes, I don't know if God, this is literally what he said to me. I don't know if God can use a bleep like me to be his messenger. Like, this guy's not even in the kingdom. He's already talking about being God's messenger. God's working. I don't know when. See, and that's what discourages us. Sometimes we want to see this happen now. I'm here to tell you, it's not fun to wait, but it's worth the wait. Can I hear an amen? Amen. It's worth the wait. And but you only join God in the work when you see God at work. So that's why we need to have our eyes open. And we need to step into this process. And so I want you to think about this idea of, lift up your eyes and look on the fields. What fields? So when you look at this here, we call it a field finder. Well, where might you put names on here? Okay, well, most people automatically start doing family. Okay? You're thinking about, hey, I want to see this family member come to Christ. I want to see this family member come to Christ. That's great. Family should be on your list. Friends, another great category. You say, okay, what friends of mine do I want to see in heaven? What friends of mine do I believe Jesus could work a radical effect in their life? And now, this may be friends, but sometimes it's not. What about your work? The people at school with you? Okay, are you looking and saying, I would like to see that person drawn? And sometimes you look at people and say, oh man, if God could reach that person. If God could reach it. Isn't it funny how we talk sometimes? We don't really see the perception of God can do anything. He's asking you to say, well, will you step in and do this? And so, when we begin to pray and notice the field and see what God's about, it changes your heart. That's what I find. Prayer changes your heart. And so as we begin to do it, so Jesus is telling them, hey, I want you guys to lift up your eyes and look on the fields. Why? Because the fields are white for harvest. They didn't think they were white. You look at this field that we're looking at, this picture here. It's green. See, there's a perception that we think we can see when somebody's ready or not. I've had people, 8 different times of sharing Christ with them, sitting 6 months under the gospel before they came to Christ. And I've had people, the first visit, after their first visit in church, have them pray at their breakfast table to receive Christ. The first time you go see them. I'm here to tell you, you do not know what God's doing, but you know this, God's working. See, so God brings you into a person's life, know that He is intending to let the light and love and life of Christ be reflected through you. So He says, lift up your eyes and realize, I'm working, I've got a harvest out there, so just make yourself available to me and be willing to do that. And so we need to open our eyes to His world. And one of the other areas I think sometimes we don't tend to think about, it's a category I call unknown. You can't really put them on your list, except you could say the cashier at the grocery store, or you could say the clerk. Because some of you see that same person every week, and you may know them because they got a name tag, and that's it. But you've never taken a step to say, would you pray about them coming to Christ? God's got a plan for us. So when we step forward and begin to do this, it's an amazing thing that I think He does in us to bring us to that place. He says, because he goes on to say in verse 36, already he who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. So he says, hey, I want you to notice the spiritual conditions of those around you. Why? Because you need to believe that a day of eternal reward and rejoicing is coming. God has something that He's going to do. And so He says, I want you to lift up your eyes. I want you to look on the fields. He says, already he who reaps is receiving wages. Now I'm here to tell you, God pays well. Some of you work for people who haven't paid well. Some of you work for people who have. Everybody's got their worst job ever. I have a pretty good list of those. I'm not sure why God gave me those experiences, but when the boss starts taking money out of your check, you're working at the wrong place. Okay, but there's spots where we'll work for a man, but He says the one who reaps is receiving wages. The one who reaps is gathering fruit for life eternal, that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. When you sow, it doesn't mean that you get a reap. Are you with me there? You work in a person's life, but you don't even know who God's going to use. And so it's not up to you to bring in the harvest. It's up to you to be engaged in the harvest. Does that make sense? That you participate in this process. And so He's telling them something. It's kind of like God needs to grow seed in you so that He can get you to give out seed. He has to let this truth resonate with his disciples to say, do you see what I'm saying to you? So that then they'll move into the harvest field. If you were on Abaco Island today, you'd be looking for survivors, but you'd be finding people who didn't survive. Do you ever think about those who were believers after a situation like this, and you wonder, what about that conversation we never had? What about that nudge I got from God and I didn't speak up to do? I wasn't willing to believe that an eternal day of reward and rejoicing is coming. That I will speak up and believe that God will work in this person's life. And I find it interesting to see again and again when you ask, God moves. But there is, it's believing the day is what? Coming. All right? So there's a process that oftentimes can be discouraging to people, and I think that we have to hang on that God can bring people's attention to the truth quite rapidly. A lot of people began praying in the Bahamas that weren't praying before the days of this happened. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what hurricane is going to hit the lives of the people that you're around. But you put the seed in the ground and let God work in the environment. Do you understand what I'm saying? You put seed in the ground and God's going to work in that situation to bring about a harvest. You plant your garden. You don't know what's going to happen during the summer. We don't know what kind of weather we're going to have. But you plant believing that there's going to be seed-enhancing weather, you know? And so, you ever wonder why sometimes we don't seem to be motivated? Why we're not willing to step up like that? Again and again, when the disciples were working in a situation, it said Jesus saw the crowd and he was moved with compassion. And I really find it says he was moved with compassion. I think we tend to think of that, at least the way I've always read it, is he was moved with compassion. Is that compassion moved his emotion? But I think it's interesting. You play with the words. You guys know I love to do that. Is that Jesus moved in compassion? His compassion is what moved him. It is what stirred him to talk to people. It's what stirred him to have this interaction. And so when we believe that a day of reward and a day of rejoicing is coming, that God will make it worth your while, then you're willing to join in this process. When you believe that God has put you where you are. And so I look at that in my neighborhood. And, you know, sharing with my neighbors has resulted in some very interesting conversations about Jesus. And we've seen numerous neighbors come to Christ. And we have had a whole turnover of people moving out. And so we're like, okay, we're starting over, you know. And so we're working with new people, building relationships. And to look at somebody's life and say, okay, they're completely rejecting this. And yet I got to say, God says he's got a day of reward and rejoicing coming. So my job is to sow seed. It's not to make the results happen. And so to have a conversation, as I did with some of my neighbors that I've mentioned that before, and know that based on their previous past spiritual experiences that they described to me, is like, this is not going to be a fun conversation. You know what I'm talking about? You just got some history sometimes with certain organizations and certain groups that are not walking in the truth like we see the truth. And I've had delightful conversations. But in my own mind, hey, there's 4 months, thing comes up. No. God says, I've got this day, already he who reaps is receiving wages. And so I've seen those very people come into the fellowship. I'm sitting there listening to the teaching. You go, wait a minute, what? You see, we think we know, but you don't know what you don't know. But I want you to know something. Jesus said this to his disciples right before he ascended into heaven, or actually right before he went to the cross in John 15, verse 16. And this is a verse I'd like us to think about. as we read it. Because it's kind of interesting how Jesus puts this. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain. And whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. Go read John 15 again. That's a glorious passage about fruitfulness. He says, hey, you didn't choose me, I chose you, I appointed you. Don't make this about you, make this about him. All right? So whatever struggle you're in to see somebody come to faith, realize that's not with you, that's with God. Let God handle it, okay? But we get to join in, he says, that those who reap are receiving wages and gathering food for life eternal. Paul had talked about, hey, I planted, Apollos watered, but what? God was causing the growth. That's what it is, God's harvest. And so when we put it in the ground, you got to believe God will reward you. But the process of harvest requires sowing seed, requires watering, actually requires weed eating, or sometimes what I call rocking. You know, you're moving rocks out of the ground in your garden. But I find that that's true in people's lives. When you're talking to somebody, here's a little illustration for you. When you're talking to somebody and they've got this objection, well, what about, okay, that's a rock in their garden. Take it out. Go ahead and answer. God's got an answer. Nobody's coming up with any answer or questions that God can't answer. God's got an answer. Answer their question, take the rock out, drop a seed underneath the rock. There's soft ground. See, sometimes people are like, oh, they've got all these objections. Okay, well, the way you get the ground ready is you take out the rocks. And so as we work this thing called the garden of God, the field of God that we're a part of, it gives us a chance to be in the harvest. And he says, in other places, what? You reap in proportion to what you sow. Isn't that right? The one who sows sparingly shall reap sparingly. You look at your life and say, okay, how many people am I talking to about Jesus? So what sort of percentage, what kind of amount am I doing something that's going to give God a chance to bring a harvest? And so we need to be a part of that. And so I just want to tell you, you trust God with this situation. Again and again, I see him work. We had the baptism there just a couple weeks ago. And pretty exciting, David. Pretty awesome seeing him to come to Christ and say, here's when I made the decision. And there's a process that is coming. And we don't know when it is. But I think it's a pretty cool God who can take an agnostic and bring a girlfriend to church because she's a believer and use that to reach him for Jesus. I think that's an awesome God. He's a part of a work that's beyond what we can understand. But you can understand this, that God is at work and God rewards well. Believe it. God will reward you. You do what God's called you to do, God will reward you. And so I want to encourage you to reap. That's what Jesus says, that there's those who are reaping. And what do we mean by reaping? It's the idea that you come to a spot where you actually invite someone to put their faith in Christ. Sometimes we just talk about Jesus, and we talk about this, or we talk about that. Sometimes people just invite people to church. You guys want me to do the fishing. And I don't mind doing fishing. I love fish, okay? But the idea that many people are never going to come through the door until they know Jesus. That's when you want to come to church, because you know Christ and you want to gather with his family. So don't be afraid to ask somebody, hey, where do you stand with God? What kind of relationship do you have? And it will lead to these interesting conversations. And that sets you up for the next thing. And look what he says. Verse 37. For this case, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. I sent you to reap. I sent you. Do you hear that? I sent you. So the third thought I have here is that you would join in the harvest process with God's team. You join in the process. So that when one sows, another reaps. You don't have to be the reaper. You don't have to be the preacher. What you have to be is you. When you stand before God someday, he's not going to say, how come you weren't more like James Downing? Unless your name is James Downing. Okay? And there's more than one of me around, but there's only one of me, okay? But you know, the idea of, I wish I was more like, don't say that. You are like the person God's made you to be. Be that person, because that's the person he's going to use to reach somebody that I'm not going to reach. All right? So we are a part of a harvesting team. So when we're doing a large-scale events, like a vacation Bible school, you know, you've got people who are doing registration. Are they part of the team? Yeah, if you don't register, this is going to get crazy, okay? And you got other people fixing snacks. That was a critical factor for every person there, right? And, you know, and then there's some who are doing the Bible drama. They're presenting that Bible story day after day to these children. And then there's somebody who's having the discussion with the children about that. Each part of the person is involved in the process, but, you know, not all of those people are going to get to pray with that child that makes a decision for Christ. But they're all a part of the team. And so we have to recognize that we have different roles, we have different effects. Nobody does it all. It's not up to you to do it all, but it's up to you to do all that you can. You can't do it all, but you can do what you can. You know, CEF is getting ready to start our Child Evangelism Fellowship and the Good News Clubs, and they'll have 50 clubs. Last year they had 1,400 children who were attending, receiving the teaching of the Word of God. 50 clubs means they need a teacher and a helper, sometimes 2 or 3 in every class. You know? Do you understand? You got a preacher because somebody worked in a Good News Club back in the 60s to present the gospel to me. You know? That you're still enjoying somebody else's labor. Do you see what he says here? You have entered into their labor. Somebody else did something before this. And so that's something that we get to join in this process. And so I want you to think about this, but he says in verse 38, he says, I sent you to reap. God sent you. Act on it. He sent you. Act on it. There's something he wants you to do in that conversation with a neighbor, in that conversation with a relative. I had a couple of interesting relative conversations recently, and it's like, do you know when you're in those kind of relationships where people won't let you go to a certain place? You know? And in that spot, for me, as I want to get there. You know what I mean? I want to have this conversation. I don't get to. But I can show the love of Christ in any conversation if I choose to. And so that's what he's calling you to. He doesn't, you don't get to decide how prepared the field is. But you know, if you intentionally engage in conversations, if you intentionally engage, as we talked last week about in good works, to letting your light shine, you will see God use you in opportunities. And it'll make a difference in other people's lives. And that's all we can do. And in Ecclesiastes 11, I like the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a little different, but I find it really talks about life in the real world. It talks about under the sun all the way through the book, which means on the planet, as though there's not heaven. But listen to what he says here. Would you read this with me? He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Now wait a second. What's he talking about? Any farmers in here understand what we're talking about? Yeah. If you look at the wind, you're never going to go out there and scatter seed. Oh, it's going to be too windy today. We can't get that done today. And you look at the clouds, anybody that's done hay and you understand that issue, you look at the clouds and go, oh no, it's going to rain. We can't put the hay down because we need 2-3 dry days, you know. You can look at circumstances and always come up with a reason why it shouldn't work. Right? He says that's not the way it works. Look at the next verse. Just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of a pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Hey, anybody in here able to give us a description of how does God form bones in the womb of a woman? You don't understand that, okay? Well, this is a bigger deal than that. This is a spiritual encounter beyond that. He says, I'm making a new baby, all right? We're a spiritual new birth. He says, you don't know the activity of God who makes all things. So what's the conclusion? The next verse. Sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. True story? Hey, you got some stuff you put in the garden this year, some of you, and it did awesome. And some of it, not so much. Right? You know, I had a pepper plant that bloomed. It's like, hey, you are not here to bloom. I've got blooming plants. You're here to produce. You know, it didn't. Okay? A lot of them did, but this one did nada. All right? You don't know. That's why you put more than one plant in, right? You share your faith with more than one person because you're in a journey. You don't know who's coming. But you know this, that God is drawing people to himself. He drew you. All right? And so I just want to encourage you guys, as we look at this idea of opening our eyes, you need to recognize the work that God is doing and join him in the harvest. There is a joy to be had just by sharing your faith and talking with someone. And you don't know what's going to happen. But you share the word because the master told you to, not because the person will trust. You follow that? I love people not so that they'll become a believer. I love people because God loves people. I'm hoping that God uses that to bring them to faith, but it doesn't always work that way. I got a call this week from a friend, and one of my drinking buddies, as you guys know those stories, or some of you do anyway, passed away. Shared Christ with him again and again. He's one would not let me get to the gospel very detailed. One time I read John 3:16. He was in the hospital waiting surgery for the cancer that eventually took him. And I said, could I just read you a verse? He goes, okay. You know, you're welcome to be sharing the truth. You know, I read John 3:16, and he looked back at me and says, I've never heard that. And I thought, oh man, this is so good. He's coming. As far as I know, he didn't. But you know, we don't get to decide that. What you get to decide is, did I obey my master? Did I love people? Because it's a good feeling to know that I know that he knew he was loved. I know that he knew what the truth was. And that's all we get to decide, is did we do what the master said? So I want to encourage you, pray first. You're leaning on the Lord to lead you, all right? And then affirm God's truth. Don't be talking yourself out of sharing your faith. Okay? You don't, oh, they're not going to believe me. Oh, they're not going to want to hear it. Oh, they're not going to. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? All these things become, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Just say it. Let me encourage you. You're going to blow it. It's okay. God knows who you are. He's going to use you anyway. All right? I've shared Christ with people, told the whole story of Christ's death, and forgot to tell them about the resurrection. You know, later on you're going, oh, man, how did you leave that out? It's happened in my work, okay? But then somebody's going, hey, you know, we were talking about that. I forgot to tell you something. You know, it just makes another opportunity to talk. Third thing, work wisely. You're put in a harvest field. Notice where God's put you. Notice the opportunities. The fields are white. If you believe him, you can respond to him. But the interesting thing is, you know, it says there's a harvest coming. You know, when we pick peaches, we then can them because I want to enjoy them all year. Because there's nothing quite like the flavor of a peach, is there? And I want you to think about this, because if you're willing to wait, God has a plan to bless you and to fill you with the joy and the sweetness that only comes from him. is, there's nothing like a harvest to bring joy to your life. Nothing. So open your eyes. God has a harvest for you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you. You've called us into your fields. You've called us to work with you. You've called us to bring the greatest news we've ever been told to other people. And we just want to be a part of that. And we want to see a harvest. Oh God, would you use me? Would you use each of us? Would you use Jerome Prairie, that we could be a part of seeing this community brought to Christ? Would you use us overseas in the Philippines and in Africa? Would you use us there in Southeast Asia, in all these places where you have planted our missionaries? Would you use us to bring the hope of Jesus Christ to those who've never yet heard or never yet trusted? So move upon us, O Lord. Change our hearts. Shape us to love you. You are so worthy of our service. We want to follow after you. In Jesus' name, amen.